YouTube? I'm Melissa Miller. A lot of you, especially if you're aviation folks, you probably don't know me or recognize me at all. I'm not an aviation expert. In fact, I'm not even actually a pilot. Nothing that I'm going to tell you here comes from an expert point of view. But I guess you're wondering, why would I make a video about a plane crash if I'm not an aviation expert? Well, so let me talk to you a little bit. I'm here to talk about the crash that occurred on 26th May of 2022 in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. You see, this flight began at Timmerman Airport in Milwaukee, which is literally right across the street from Wauwatosa. I grew up in that neighborhood. I lived barely a mile from the airport. In fact, we used to be able to go out in the backyard and watch the planes as they'd overfly our house while they were doing pattern work. And it's that airport that is very much responsible for my interest in aviation as it is today. Additionally, I myself am a student pilot. This crash on 26th May involved a student pilot who was very new, had only just started soloing. In fact, according to news reports, he had only done a few solos. And so for me, as an aviation buff, a student pilot myself, with this occurring so close to home, this one really got to me, and it put a lot of fear into me, and it really made me question my decision to be studying to get my own private pilot certificate. So let's talk about this crash. For those of you that haven't heard about it, first of all, 26th of May 2022, as I mentioned, about 2:56 p.m. or 14:56 p.m. local time, that's 1956 UTC, an 18-year-old student pilot named Daniel Perlman was involved in a crash. Daniel was a student at Northwestern University. In fact, he was one of the leaders of the Northwestern Aviation Club. Daniel was practicing his touch and goes at Timmerman Airport when he crashed into the backyard of a home in Wauwatosa, as I said, right across the street from the airport, just shortly after taking off from runway 22. A few days later, over the Memorial Day weekend, Daniel was pronounced brain dead, and some of his organs, according to his family, were donated, and Daniel passed. Now, as I said, his family said he started soloing in April, and, so he was very new. Clearly someone who had a passion for aviation his whole life. The local Jewish Center set up actually a really wonderful website that I'll put the link down below. I hope you'll visit. It's called deedsfordaniel.com, and it's a great way to commemorate this young man. But so on 26th May 2022, Daniel set off in 1979 Cessna 152, tail number N4978 Bravo. He had flown this plane before. This was the trainer he was working in. The plane is owned by Spring City Aviation, which is a local FBO and flight training facility. Operates out of a couple airports here in southeastern Wisconsin. And as I said, in this case, he was taking off from KMWC Airport or Timmerman Airport in Milwaukee. So now when I heard about this, these days I live about a half hour northwest of Timmerman Airport, and I'm taking my flight lessons at a different airport. But when I first heard about this crash on the news, I'll admit I was a little concerned because we were having an interesting weather day. And there was a lot of spotty storms, a lot of pop-up storms and whatever. And my first question was, why was somebody even taking off, given how the weather was that day? And this is before I even knew for sure if it was a student pilot. We didn't know a lot of details at that time. But so that was one of my first thoughts. However, when I went and looked at the weather, honestly, in the vicinity of the airport, it was a reasonably good VFR day. The storms weren't really around the airport. I know it's probably hard to see here, but you can kind of see where I've marked where KMWC is. It was, you can see the METAR conditions at the bottom. Everything looked good. So, okay, this is probably not something weather related. And then later started to come out that, the pilot had reported, engine trouble in this case. So, okay, probably not something weather related. So let's talk about what we do know. As I said, we know he's a student pilot. We know he was 18 years old. We know he was only doing he'd only done a few solo flights. This was, he had started in April doing solos. So this was maybe, already third or fourth or something. They said a few flights. So he was new to flying alone. And as we look at the flight tracker, you can see that he did successfully complete his first takeoff, flew the pattern, and landed. And from this, we can kind of presume, and also from the audio, which we'll play in a little bit, it's pretty clear that he flew one complete circuit, was doing a touch and go, and it was after takeoff on his touch and go that Daniel reported the trouble with the engine. Now, as I listened to this, I kind of missed this the first time. A couple of people pointed it out, but it ended up not being engine trouble at all. In fact, what you'll hear in a minute is you'll hear that Daniel actually figured out what the problem was, and yet he still crashed. And this is why I want to talk about this. You see, because I'm a student pilot. Again, I am not the expert in aviation. Nothing I'm going to say here. If you're a student pilot, please don't take anything I say verbatim. My point here is not to tell you what Daniel did wrong necessarily or anything like that. It's to simply bring to light some of the things that we know happened, some of the things that seem like logical explanations for what happened, and then the questions that are going through my mind as a student pilot. Because you see, we see all these aviation experts who talk about these crashes and, they give us the view of a well-seasoned pilot or even CFI. But what about us as student pilots? What's going through our heads? What's our perspective? And so that's why I really wanted to share today. So let's take a listen to the audio, and I've transcribed it below just in case. So the first thing we see is that at about 1953 Zulu, Daniel gets his clearance to land for a touch and go. He gets cleared for the option on runway 22 right.
4978 Bravo, runway 22 right, cleared for the option. Cleared for the option, runway 22 right for Cessna 4978 Bravo.
And that's it. Okay, cleared for the option. He's going to come in and land. He's going to do a touch and go, and he's going to go around. I'm sure he's practiced this a million times with the CFI. All of us as student pilots, we know that we end up doing a lot of this. I've not even soloed yet, and I already know what to expect. I'm going to see a lot of touch and go practice because that's how we learn so much. It keeps us on our toes. For situations that are quite honestly some of the most dangerous. We've probably all heard many of the horror stories of that base to final turn and stall spins that occur and all the other things. I mean this is a very tough time in the flight circuit. It's one of the more difficult phases of flight for anybody that's had to learn how to fly. Trying to land a plane is tough. So he gets that clearance, and about 2.5 minutes later, apparently after landing and now starting to take off again, Daniel reports the engine trouble.
Ground reporting engine failure. It's not working. It's not working. 978 Bravo, Tim Tower, roger. I'm stalling. I don't know what to do. Are you solo? I'm sorry, I didn't have my flaps up. I might.
And that's the last transmission we hear from Daniel. Now, the first time I listened to that, I missed something very important. And that's that transmission after a short pause where he comes back to the tower and he apologizes and says he didn't have his flaps up. So for a young student pilot flying a little Cessna 152 with about 118 horsepower, taking off with your flaps up, you're not going to get the same level of performance, climb performance, speed, etc., that you would normally be accustomed to in that airplane. So it's understandable to some degree that Daniel would, think engine trouble right away. I'm not seeing the speed. I'm not getting my climb performance. What's going on here? And he reaches out to the tower for help. And then he says these words. Listen to this again.
I'm sorry, I didn't have my flaps up.
I didn't have my flaps up. So he identified the issue. He knew what was wrong. He got it. Okay, we should be fine, right? But then it's only a few moments later, about 10 seconds later, listening to the audio, we can tell that now Daniel has crashed because we get that almost ominous call from the tower that we never want to hear.
70 Bravo 10 Tower, are you up?
He's trying to raise him on the frequency, and Daniel's not there. Now, at this point, this is all we know about this crash. It's 31 May as I'm recording this. Obviously, NTSB and FAA have taken the plane, and they're going to do their investigation. So what we know is that Daniel did a touch and go. As he was taking off, he was having problems, probably with climbing. He felt like the engine was failing. He radios the tower, and then he realizes his flaps aren't up. And that's why he's having the trouble. So the question, of course, becomes, well, if he figured it out, why did he crash? And this is where I want to start talking about what I think happened, what seems like a plausible explanation based on what little bit I know as a student pilot, and what really, as I think about it from a student pilot perspective, what I think might be the issue here. So if we think about how we do touch and goes, think about you come in and you do a touch and go. You land that plane and you're on your ground roll. The next process is bring all the flaps up. If you're flying an older Cessna like this, it's mixture full rich, carb heat off. Maybe you quickly hit the trim, but then you're going. You're throttle up and you're going to take off again. And we do it kind of in that order. Maybe, probably, I would guess you would do the trim after you throttle up. But that's what we're trying to do. That's the process that we're taught of how we do a touch and go. Land the plane, get stabilized on your ground roll, clean up the plane, and take off again. So Daniel noticed he missed a step there somehow, right? He at minimum, we know from what he said, he didn't bring the flaps up. So what's the response? Well, if I'm thinking as a student pilot, like I just did a touch and go, I know that, hey, if I missed that step, I'm supposed to bring the flaps up. Now, he could have had 20, 30 degrees of flaps. We don't know. But the problem is you bring all those flaps up at once. He's not on the ground anymore. He's not ground rolling. He's in the air. He's in a completely different phase of flight. He's not in that ground roll anymore. He's in a climb state. And if you bring in all those flaps at once, what happens? We lose lift. So my guess here, and it seems plausible, is Daniel probably pulled back all those flaps because that's what his training taught him. That's what he was accustomed to doing as part of a touch and go. Bring the flaps completely back up, and then, power on. So that would have been like the natural response, but those of us who aren't like me, who have actually been doing this for a while, have learned this lesson probably, or we've all been taught this. I've even been taught this, that, when you're up in the air and you take those flaps out, you're going to lose lift. So my guess is he brought it probably from, 20 or 30 degrees to 0 flaps all at once, lost lift. Maybe that alone was enough to crash, or maybe he did the next thing. I mean, you could hear in the radio how flustered, predictably, he is. I mean, as a young student pilot, scary things are happening. It's completely out of the norm. It's not what he's used to. It's not what he's practiced. So when I start falling after pulling up my flaps, and I've already been freaked out by the fact that I thought I was having engine problems, the natural tendency is going to be pulled back on that yoke. And it seems, especially from the way he crashed into that backyard without colliding with any of the homes in that area, it seems very likely that, he pulled back, stalled that aircraft, and the aircraft just dropped out of the sky. So, I'll admit, for me as a student pilot, as scared as I was having heard all this, and, this was the part where I felt like, okay, This was a pilot error. It's something that we can learn from. It's something that we can learn to do differently. And there's a couple key lessons that I think we need to at least question here, that I want to question. In fact, I'm hoping I can get some CFIs to listen to this and check out this video and give me their thoughts. Because I would really like to know what others think about my theories here, because again, I'm a student pilot. I don't know. And in fact, the only reason I'm doing this, if Daniel's family happens to see this, I want you guys to know the reason I'm doing this. I don't monetize my channel. I barely create any content. But I'm hoping that we can all learn something from this. Because at the end of the day, we all want to be safer pilots. And if Daniel's tragedy can help with that, I'd like to do that. So the first thing I noticed is I feel like Daniel lost sight of one of those key things that we're taught. And that is the idea of aviate, navigate, communicate. Now you hear him right away after the touch and go. He gets on that radio pretty fast to announce to the tower that he's having engine trouble. It's a natural reaction, but it goes against what we're taught, right? I mean, let's face it. The tower can't come fix your plane for you in that moment. And so we know that first step is we have to just, my CFI tells the story of, when something goes wrong, wind your watch. I'm sure more than just a few of you have heard that too. Like if Daniel could have just taken that step back for one moment and examined the situation that was going on. He obviously did some of that. He figured out that the flaps were on, or the flaps were down. And he wanted to take care of that. He's early in soloing. He's used to having a CFI next to him, so it's natural for him to want to, call out right away for help rather than reverting to his own training and just aviating. Even without full takeoff performance, the plane was flying. He was up in the air. He got off the ground with flaps out. So the plane's flying. Now, it's not giving him the climb performance. It's not giving him speed. You hear him. He said he was stalling. But what do we do when we're stalling? How do we prevent that? Get the stall horn to stop. We bring the nose down a bit. Clearly, again, from where he landed and what he didn't make contact with, he was already higher than the obstacles around him. This is one of those cases where I feel like we just, my thought on this is just take what the plane is going to give you for now. It's not going to give you your normal 500 foot per minute climb rate that maybe you're used to or whatever it is in that particular 152. But take what it gives you, fly the plane first, stay in the air. Then navigate. Now start looking for where can I land this thing. Now if we go back and we look at his flight track, and actually I'm going to bring up, you can see where the crash site is on here, but I'm going to bring up the aerial view. And so here's the aerial view, and you see runway 22 left. It's, the one running from the upper right to the lower left. And you can see the pink dot there again where the crash site is. There's not a lot of options around here, right? So this is, again, where it's important to, step one, take what the plane's giving you and just fly the plane. Keep it in the air. If you have to level off at, 200 feet, level off at 200 feet. There's not a lot of options to land, but there's also not a lot of really tall items here. In fact, I can tell you that the elevation from the end of runway 22 left down to that street that you see actually drops off. There's a valley there. And so he definitely had a chance, and I think, to just keep that plane in the air, even with the flaps out. Not an ideal situation, but it would have continued to fly. But his next step is navigating and looking for a place to land, or looking for where can I put this thing down, or can I get back to the airport with the altitude I've got or I'm potentially able to gain. Could the plane maybe climb at a slower rate but get him some altitude? I don't think he ever got to find that out. So this is one of those things where I feel like Daniel rushed to the communicate part, but what he really would have helped him was if he could have taken that step back. And that's a thing we hear from our CFIs all the time is aviate, navigate, communicate. Keep the plane in the air first. Don't jump on the radio right away. Unfortunately, though, easier said than done. New pilot, student pilot, only a couple solos under his belt. I can't even imagine what that would be like. I hope that I never have to experience that feeling. So I don't fault Daniel in the least. But again, something that I'm taking from this is a renewed focus on that concept of aviate, navigate, communicate. Now, the next thing I think that's an issue here that I learned from this, that I'm taking from this, and I hope rightfully so, is I think there's a natural tendency here. I mentioned it before. I think we have to be more focused on recognizing the differences in the phases of flight. As I said, when we do our touch and goes, we're taught, we get that plane on the ground, stabilized in the ground roll, and we clean it up. All the flaps come out all at once. Carb heat's off, everything, the usual, that whole process. But if something goes wrong in there, we missed the step of taking the flaps back. Well, he got airborne. He was up in the air. So he's no longer in takeoff phase. He's now in a climb phase. And what he needed to recognize, and what I think, me as a pilot now I want to recognize and really focus on, is the fact that that is a different phase of flight where different rules apply. No longer can I just pull all the flaps out at once because I'm not on the ground anymore. I'm going to lose lift. Instead, I have to think about it now in the situation like a go-around, where in a go-around, what do? We've got 30 degrees of flaps out. We push in the carb heat. We push in full throttle at the same time. And maybe we take out the first 10 degrees of flaps in a lot of planes. We bring it back to 20 degrees. But we leave the rest of the flaps there until we get a positive rate of climb. And then we take more flaps out, but not all of them yet. And then as we're climbing, we can take the last bit out. And it's all that incremental step so we don't lose all that lift that the flaps are generating for us at that low speed. We don't take that out and lose it all at once. So I think this is, a case where it's a good reminder, at least to me, to recognize that difference of, okay, yes, I was doing a touch and go, but now, however I left the ground, in whatever configuration my plane was in, my plane is now in a different phase of flight, and the rules have changed, and I have to use the rules that now apply to that phase of flight, which instead of takeoff, it's now climb. So then this gets me thinking, this is the last thing I want to throw out there. And again, this is not, please, whatever you do not take this as me looking to place blame or anything else. I'm literally asking questions as a student pilot who wants to learn and grow and be safe. But I'm wondering if instructors could maybe approach lessons a little differently too. Like I said, we do touch and goes all the time as student pilots. That's just part of the experience. It's part of what we need to learn. But how often do CFIs talk to us about how we react if we make a mistake, right? And specifically thinking about how many times have you been told as a student pilot when you do a touch and go, if you forget to take out the flaps, how to handle that situation? Or if you forget the carb heat, what's the right way to handle it? Do you just take it all out at once? Do you get a good climb going and get some margin for error there first and then take it out? And how many times do you hear from a CFI about really recognizing those changes in the phases of flight and how our reactions to things change from when we're on a takeoff roll versus to now the plane's in the air and we're trying to climb? I'll admit, I haven't heard any of that from my CFI. Now, I've got barely 10 hours with my CFI doing touch and goes. We've probably only done for a matter of a couple hours. So, I don't know. But these are the things I think about. At the end of the day, this is a tragic accident. It's one that it's rocked me to the core. That's the only reason why I've chosen to do this video, because it really shook me as somebody who's had a lifelong dream to become a pilot. It really made me question whether that was something I should still be pursuing. looking at it now and seeing it in this way has helped, but I also want to throw it out to all of you, and I'm looking for your comments. I'm looking for your thoughts. Am I on the right track here? Am I thinking about this wrong? Should I be thinking about it differently as a student pilot? Because I want to be safer. I want all of the student pilots out there to be safe. I don't want to see more tragedies like this. None of us do. And if we can help avoid that, I think it's important to ask those questions. So thank you all for tuning in. I really hope this video was helpful. I know it got longer than I expected to record it for, but it was important to me to get this out there, and I hope that you'll share your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Be safe.